Thanks for tuning in to the HR Uprising podcast. I'm your host, Lucinda. The HR Uprising is focused on helping forward-thinking people professionals deliver real lasting value in their organisations. I'm a chartered psychologist, speaker and trainer, and recently authored the best-selling business book, How to Be a Change Superhero. My day job is founder and CEO of software and training business Actus. This gives me the opportunity to work with other businesses like yours. We are focused on building a better workplace for people wherever they are located, with the help of our performance, learning and talent management software and our training and consultancy services. Every week on the podcast, I will be covering different topics and challenges, joined by relevant experts and real-life people professionals. Thank you so much for tuning in. I really hope you enjoy and get value from this week's episode. Hello and welcome to this week's HR Uprising podcast. And this week, I'm delighted to have a repeat guest in the form of Rameez Kaleem from 3R Strategy. And Rameez is going to take us through the research recently that they've been involved in, which is salary trends for 2023. And given inflation and all the pressures, I thought it's never been a more interesting time to understand this. And rather than us all having to go through the detail ourselves, I thought I'd ask Rameez to explain it and translate it for us. So Rameez, please introduce yourself and thank you for joining me once again on the HR Uprising podcast.
Hi, Lucinda. Thanks for inviting me again. As you know, my focus is all around pay transparency. And so that was one of the reasons that we ran this report, is really to find out how organizations are managing pay, and giving some insights into market practice, and insights into what sort of budgets organizations were setting, which, I think is always an interesting topic for HR professionals because they're setting budgets for the year and what that should be, negotiating with unions. But this year in particular, with the record inflations, I think it was really a topic of discussion for a lot of HR professionals. So we ran a survey towards the end of last year and had over 500 organizations participate in that survey. And we asked them a number of questions around their pay budget. So what was their pay budget for 2022 and what was their forecast pay budget for 2023? And I think the budget, the median for 2022 came out to be 4%. And there was slight variation. So the lower quartile was 3%, upper quartile was 5%. But the numbers for 2023, which I thought they might be slightly higher, but the median was 5%. And I thought maybe there were some companies that would have had a much higher pay increase, but actually when we looked at the results, the vast majority of companies said that their pay budgets were 5%. So while the median was 5%, the upper quartile was also 5%. So it just really demonstrated that although inflation was at record levels, most companies really just couldn't afford that level of inflation.
Totally match it. So when you're saying the median for 2023 was 5%, there wasn't a great deal of range. You're saying it was the top quartile as well was 5%. So pretty much everybody, the maximum. I mean, were there any real outliers? Was anyone trying to hit 10%?
I think that there were some high numbers. So, because we're talking about a big sample. So, I mean, the way to look at these numbers is let's say if you have 100 organizations, and what we're doing is we're ranking those 100 organizations from your lowest budget to your highest budget. Yes. The number that sits in the middle is the median. So that's 5%. And the number that is the 75th highest number out of the 100 is your upper quartile. So if you start to look at the 90th percentile or 95th percentile, you will have numbers in there like 10%, for example, or 12%. But the vast majority of companies said 5%.
Sorry, I thought you said earlier that it was also in the top quartile. So either the top, as in 20.
The upper quartile.
Right. So 5% was the upper quartile, which in my understanding,
yes.
Right. So there wasn't. So that my interpretation of that is there wasn't a great deal of variation in score.
There wasn't for the vast majority of cases, but you will have the odd company that did try and match inflation. So when we looked at, there were a few companies from aerospace and defense, and they had a high upper quartile of 7.8%. Logistics and distribution had an upper quartile of 6%. Insurance had an upper quartile of 6.5%. FS 7%. So there were some outliers, but in the whole, I think 5% was the most common number.
Right. Okay. And so those sort of industries, did you get any insight as to why they would be paying more? I'm assuming it's competition for talent. Is that the reason as to why some would pay more?
Yes, I think, ultimately it comes down to affordability and, like you said, competition for talent. And because most organizations are thinking, we want to do as much as we can, particularly when you look at the charity sector, they're thinking we want to try and do as much as we can, but it's just not affordable to have a 10%, because it's not just, a 10% pay rise, it then impacts all your other costs, including pensions, and it's an ongoing cost for the future. So that's why companies are more cautious. But when it comes to sectors like financial services, and I know we worked with a few clients within life sciences, there's a lot of competition for talent in life sciences and pharmaceutical sectors. And so I think that's part of the reason that they were looking for higher budgets, because, we had the great resignation as well. And they were really struggling to recruit. And that is the reason that they pushed some of those higher budgets. What this doesn't take into account, though, is the variable pay and bonus. So while you don't have variable pay in in the public sector, in the charity sector, education sector, within financial services, they had a slightly higher budget at the upper quartile. They also tend to have bonuses, and so they will have base salary increases, but they will also try and compensate people through one-off payments, which we actually have seen in other sectors as well. So we've seen a number of charities say, we're going to give you a one-off payment to support you with the cost of living increases, whether that's a one-off payment. In some cases, although there's more admin, they've split it over the 12 months to say, you have higher monthly bills, so this is to support you with those bills.
So they're not committing to it being on the books forever on the hope that inflation will come down, but giving people support in sort of cost of living payments, either in lumps or by spreading it out.
Exactly. Yeah.
What did you have a sense of what proportion of those surveyed were doing cost of living payments?
So it wasn't part of this survey, but we've run other sort of pulse surveys in webinars and so on. And a recent webinar we ran where we asked people if they were doing cost of living increases. It was almost sort of half the organizations were doing something, the other half weren't. And then within the half that were doing something, it was either a one-off payment, or they were looking to do something like a monthly. We have seen organizations do other things as well. So things like introducing new benefits, shopping discounts. So they gives them discounts with supermarkets, things like benefits where people are able to, in some cases, get advance payment for some of their salaries, because when you have things like your car insurance renewal, you have a big lump sum payment to be paid in a particular month, and so getting advance payment. So they've also tried to do some innovative things through benefits as well.
And on the cost of living type payments, do you have a sense of what sort of figures people were offering?
It really varies. I think what most organizations have tried to do is have payments that are meaningful. So you don't want to give everyone, £100 or £200 pay increase. That doesn't really have much of an impact. So we've seen lots of
tax and
exactly. So there were lots of large organizations like Rolls-Royce that did lump sum payments. I can't remember all the company names, but there were payments ranging from sort of £1,500 to £2,500. We've also seen cases where companies will look at their budgets and say, actually, we can only afford, with the budget that we've set, to give, I don't know, £800 to everyone. So what we're going to do is we're going to focus on people that are below a particular salary, and give like a 1,500 payment to everyone below a particular salary. Sometimes it's below a particular job level. Those things can be a little bit tricky, because if you have, if your cutoff point is 30,000 and somebody's on 30,200, then they lose out. So those things can be a bit tricky, but there are different ways and lots of different things that different organizations have been doing.
Yeah, it's tricky, isn't it, as to what is fair? Is fair giving people who earn the least, more, or, a really, really challenging one. That's why I think it's very interesting and useful for our listeners to have a sense of what other people are doing, isn't it? Because you only really see what's going on in your organization. Just going back to one of the things you said earlier, because I'm not sure if I was totally following the terminology. So you talked about within sectors, and you talked about the quartiles again. Now, are you talking then about within an organisation, as in a variance of, and I suppose this my question is, when you were asking people about their pay rise budget, say they have a budget of 5%, were they giving everybody 5% flat, and therefore your quartiles you were talking about within industry, or were you talking about the variation within a company where they were distributing that pot of 5% within their company?
So I think that varies by organisation, and you will have a lot of organizations, and this is, I think in the non-profit sector, public sector, if you set a budget of 4%, everyone gets a 4% increase.
Yeah.
But then in other organizations, particularly, for example, financial services, it might be performance-based. So people might be given a performance rating. So if you rated a good, you get 3%. If you rated outstanding, you get 7%. And that's how they manage it. So this was also one of the questions that we did ask in the survey, to say, do you link performance to pay, or do you give everyone the same amount? And we had 17% of organizations that said that they link their salary to performance. 22% said that they link bonus to performance, and another 38% said that they link both salary and bonus to performance. So
another 18, did you say then?
Sorry?
What was the third figure?
Oh, the third figure was 38%. So they link both the salary and the bonus to performance. So if you sort of add that up, that's 60%, or actually, if you look at all of them, it's 77% are saying that they link pay to performance in some way. But then that varies by sector. So in the charity sector, 74% of organizations said that they don't link pay for performance.
Right, yeah.
But within financial services, pretty much everyone said, I think it was 97% said that they do link pay for performance. So that very much varies by organization and sector.
And that in itself is quite an interesting one. I don't know how much detail you've got behind it, and I don't know whether you can answer this question, because I'm going to throw at you, but I'll ask you anyway. Because I have a sense that performance-related pay, or sort of gradings, because obviously that links to appraisals, which we do a lot of, I feel that it's less popular than it has been. Now, I don't know whether that's a factor of the types of companies that we're working with. I totally agree that charities and public sector are not able to do it, and it would still be the norm in somewhere like financial services. Do you have a sense of, do you think it's this, I don't know whether you've asked this question previously in research, but do you have a sense of whether it's more or less popular, or about the same than it was, say, 3-5 years ago?
I think if we look, because there's the link to salary, then there's link to the bonus.
Yes.
If we look at the link to salary, I think that has definitely gone down from maybe 20 years ago.
Yeah.
Where most organizations.
Yeah.
And I think there are a couple of reasons for that. One is, in the past, budgets have been quite low. So if you've got a 2% budget, 3% budget, there's not much differentiation. If you have to be in the 90th or 95th percentile to be outstanding, and you get an extra 2% pay increase, and that's not really motivating for anyone.
Yeah, and actually, I suppose when we've got higher budgets at the moment, maybe it is more interesting.
Yeah.
Yes, that's very true, isn't it? That 3% doesn't make a
break. So I think that's base salary. I think the bonus element is still very much linked to performance for most organizations. And it's usually a mixture of individual performance and company performance. So how the company does, and the measures around company performance are changing, adapting as well, because there's a lot more, in the past, it might have been just financial measures, EBITDA. Now, increasingly, you're starting to see things like customer satisfaction. Larger organizations are starting to introduce things like ESG, where about sustainability, governance, all those, diversity inclusion measures.
At individual company level.
Sorry?
That would be at company level, an ESG type performance.
Yes, that would be at company level. But again, and in larger organizations where you have shareholders, investors, it can be a measure for the execs as well. So at the executive level, it can be a measure that comes in.
Right. Okay. That's quite interesting. So just to clarify, then you'd say that really overall, even though you're saying sort of 67% was it when we added those up, of them actually came to people were doing a link with salary, a link with performance related elements of it. It's more predominantly in a bonus payment rather than in a salary increase, or it has been, is what you're saying generally. Oh, sorry, I think you're going to clarify. I'll come back. I've got a second question on the individual, because you were talking about corporate level measures. I'll throw it at you, then you can answer both points at the same time. The other one, I was wondering, are you seeing more companies when they're looking at individual performance, also looking at things like behaviours, like measuring values and stuff? I don't know if it goes that. I'll let you answer, then you're nodding for the benefit.
Yeah. So on the first one, I think bonus definitely is linked to performance in most cases. But I think salary for a lot of organizations is still linked to performance. I think what is the trend is that where you said that organizations are moving away, I think what a lot of them are moving away from is performance ratings. So they're moving away from giving ratings to people to say you're a 2, you're a 3, you're a 4, but having more of a fluid process with regular check-ins, seeing how people are doing against their objectives, but not setting annual objectives, setting more regular objectives. So I think that performance element in a lot of organizations is still taking place because they want to differentiate pay increases for their exceptional contributors and performers, people who are going above and beyond, but not putting people into buckets. So I think there's a decline in performance ratings, but we've actually seen some non-profit and charity organizations going down this route, where in the past they've had a pure length of service-based pay increase, the spine point increase, and now they're saying, people are getting to the top end of their pay bands, and there's risks around equal pay and age discrimination. So you have two people doing the same job, same contribution. Somebody's just been there 10 years, and hence they're on an extra £8,000. And so there's actually a shift towards performance and contribution. And it sort of links in with your second point around behaviors, because traditionally a lot of the performance-based approach has been around, looking at your objectives over the last 12 months and how people are doing against those objectives, and that's your performance. And what we do is we look at the past performance to give people a pay increase. And a couple of challenges. One is that, performance can fluctuate from year to year. And we do this because we think that past performance is our best predictor of future performance. But actually behaviors are a better predictor, because while performance can fluctuate from year to year, behaviors tend to be more consistent. And so what we call it is like a total contribution approach. And a total contribution approach is not just looking at output, but it's looking at the input. And the input is all around the behaviors that are consistent with your exceptional performers and contributors. So what are they doing and how are they behaving that consistently leads to exceptional performance? And what are the behaviors that are aligned to your organizational values and the culture that you're looking to create in your organization? And it's that message of, it's not just about what you deliver, but it's about making sure that we are creating the right culture in our organization and that we're delivering things in the right way. So, for example, if we include things like customer satisfaction as a measure, there's a lot of research that says, if you behave in the right way, you have excellent customer service, ultimately that leads to higher revenue. And so behaviors become a lot more important.
Yeah, that's interesting. So the same things with things like engagement. So I think you could maybe think of things like management behaviours, I suppose you could use as a measure there as well. So I can see how that could be more effective or certainly helpful for an organisation, seeing the bigger picture rather than just narrow performance. That's, let's say I'm a salesperson and I'm in a sector that's got no money, or that obviously I can't sell into it for whatever reason to do with external events, whereas someone else might luck in. But I may be contributing in other ways. So I can definitely see how that's a good way of looking more broadly. Can I go back to your other point and see, but I don't know, of course, everyone's moving to, well, I say everyone, lots of people that I'm talking to are moving to regular check-ins, ongoing objectives. It's a much more effective way of actually driving people to perform, right? So annual objectives don't make sense. But what I would love to know is what is the magic formula, though, for organisations to objectively evaluate performance across the organisation without having some sort of culmination? Now, you can take away a rating and give it a label, but I don't really understand how you can still be objective and fair without some sort of oversight or calibration at some point, and it's usually going to be annual, in order to think about how you're going to distribute reward fairly. Is there some other magic formula that you've come across out there?
I mean, unfortunately, there isn't a magic formula, but with a lot of these processes, it's I think there are two challenges. One is the starting point for our employees. So if we have the same outcome for everyone, it doesn't mean that it's fair, because the way in a lot of organizations, we don't have a consistent way in how we decide salary for our people. And they will ask questions like, what is your current salary? What is your expectation? Or it's up to people's ability to negotiate during the recruitment process. So you could, same example, you could be doing the same job, making this similar contribution, but one person is on 40,000, but the other person has managed to negotiate a salary of 48,000. And so if we say, let's go through a calibration and see that they're getting a similar pay increase because of their performance, that inequity is never going to be bridged. And so I think that's one concern.
That leveling though, I mean, yeah, okay, so that's a percentage type thing, and I suppose there's other ways you could address that. If we talked about a bonus, though, for example, in terms of how you allocate a bonus, which you said that more companies are doing that rather than linking salary, then you can treat everyone the same if it's the same pot, I guess, if it's proportions of the same pot. And I take your point about the leveling. Is it fair? Because it's what salaries people come in on. I take that point. It's more about, how do you assess? Is there a better way of assessing performance relative to other people to distribute it fairly? I
think bonus is a good example, because everyone is at the same level, and you're trying to assess how people are doing. I think you will always have a level of subjectivity, because we're not machines. Everyone is different, and ultimately we have to trust line managers who, if they are having their weekly or regular check-ins with people within their team, to be able to make that assessment. But I think what we do need is a framework and a set of definitions that tells us that if somebody, let's say you have a bonus of 10 to 20%, so the midpoint is 15, exceptional is 20, at the lower end is 10. We need a set of definitions to say, these are our expectations on what should happen, what the outcomes should be, and what the behaviors should be if somebody is to get 20%. Because if a line manager makes a case for 20%, then if there are regular check-ins, if there are these discussions, the more regular objectives, they're able to demonstrate why they've made a case for that 20%. And that applies to salary as well. So what we would say is, if you have a salary range, again, of 40 to 50,000, is to really define for your organizations to say, for the culture that we want in our organization, for what we think leads to exceptional contribution, these are the behaviors and the outputs that we expect at 50,000, at 40,000, and 45,000, so that then when your line managers are making decisions, yes, there will be some level of subjectivity, but they're all using the same set of definitions and a framework to start with.
They put some clarity into the process in terms of the definitions so that you can push back. But ultimately, that process, you're still, even if you're saying you're still putting some sort of ranking in at the end of the day, managers are still making a case for the effectiveness of their people. And it sounds like HR have still got to have that oversight to ensure that, because they know which managers are the ones who set flaky objectives or shout louder for their people relatively, and there's so many areas for bias. And so I think this is the challenge, isn't it, making sure AR managers have got the clarity of the process, B, they've got the skill to do it, and C, there's some sort of oversight, calibration, education process to try and ensure that it's applied as fairly as possible.
Yeah, you have this in some large organization like Google, for example, where even when it comes to the promotion process there, it's not just up to the line manager to make that decision on who gets promoted, and there's a panel that makes that decision. So it's about the line manager providing the recommendation and providing the evidence. And if they're not setting objectives, they're not having their one-to-ones, they won't have the evidence to provide. And so I think that puts some emphasis on the line managers to say, you will then have to go away and have this difficult conversation with somebody to say, you didn't set the objectives and now you don't have any evidence to provide. So this panel, how can they approve something? So maybe I think that's a good idea, is having a panel to make some of those decisions rather than give one person that ultimate responsibility.
So it's still as tricky as it's ever been, I think. I'm not surprised there's no magic wand, but I was just, it'd been interesting if anyone had come up with a solution. I suppose and before we just sort of start to wrap up, going back to your salary planning report, it was really interesting. I mean, the take home is interesting that, really 5% seems to be about the budget for this year in terms of things. How you distribute it is in itself a challenge, which we've just talked about. There are people applying, in addition to that, these cost of living payments, maybe just to cushion it, but make sure we don't sort of reflect these costs in our businesses forever going forwards. And also we've covered that actually a high proportion of the organisations that are applying some sort of performance related pay, more to bonuses, but also to salaries in some of them. Were there any other takeaways that we've maybe missed out on or haven't covered that jump out at you from your report, or surprises, or anything else as a takeaway that would be useful for our audience?
Yeah, I think the one that really stuck out for me, maybe because I have this real focus on pay transparency, was around we asked organizations how many of them from the 500 participants, how many of them have salary ranges? And from the sample, 59% of organizations said that they had salary ranges. But out of this list of 59%, only 24% said that they published those salary ranges for everyone to see. So 76% of organizations said that they go through the work of putting together salary ranges, include them in their budget, but they're choosing not to share that information with employees. They're choosing not to share that information when there are advertised jobs, even though we know that there's a significant increase in applicants when we provide that information. So that to me was really, well, I guess not completely surprising, but just the numbers, because that 24% is also skewed a little bit by sectors like charity, non-public sector, that have much higher levels of transparency. Education as well. So when you look at sectors, I mean, I can give you some numbers. If we look at life sciences, only 7% of organizations said that they published the salary ranges. Within financial services, it was 11%.
Why, right? Because they basically pay as much as they have to, or as little as they have to, don't they? I would say to get the talent. So if someone's earning whatever, and this is the right person they want to bring in, so they make a case to pay that person. Could be twice the amount that someone else. And I guess that's where other issues like gender pay gap and everything can really come in terms of those. Whereas higher education and NHS and things like that, there's a sort of these defined boundaries, I guess. But are you saying charities, they probably have variation, but they do publicise it, but they have to be accountable, don't they, more externally? Is that why, do you think?
I think that can be part of the reason, but also, when you don't have the ability to pay the high salaries of financial services, and the research also shows us that what most people are looking for is just knowing that they're being treated fairly. And that transparency in the charity sector, that transparency, for example, in the education sector, demonstrates to people that we have a fair process. And I think you will start to see a trend in this direction, because this all the research also tells us Generation Z employees they're actually willing to sacrifice on some of the pay to seek an environment where they get transparency and a sense of purpose. And there's also legislation coming in. So there's a number of states in the US that have introduced pay transparency, and there's an EU directive coming in next quarter. And member states in the EU will have up to 3 years to comply to this legislation, which includes things like you have to have salary ranges, you can't ask people about their current salary, and it gives employees more power over what they can ask for. So they can ask for average salary rates for their job and what people are paying. So in the next few years, this is coming in, and either organizations will move in this direction or they're going to be forced to do it.
Well, I don't know if they are. Are they always bound by it if it's EU? Now we're independent.
Yeah. Yes, that is a good point, because it doesn't apply to the UK because we've left, but organizations that will have operations in Europe will probably be impacted.
Yeah.
They will also want to be consistent with their European operations in the UK. But I think there's also going to be pressure on the UK government, because the UK gender pay gap is one of the highest in Europe. And given that we already do the gender pay gap reporting for over 250 employees, which is part of this EU directive, I think that there's going to be pressure, and likely that the UK government will adopt some of these laws.
I didn't realise that our pay gap was one of the highest in Europe. I mean, so the transparency point, I guess this is almost an entire extra episode, and I know this is a subject that you are really passionate about, Rameez, and congratulations. Rameez's book, A Case of the Mondays, has been shortlisted for the Best Business Book Awards, hasn't it? So good luck with that. That's on the 20th. I suppose in terms of the transparency things, I mean, you've alluded to it a little bit. I guess from an employer's point of view, they are fearful, aren't they? Fearful of doing this because of the fact they believe it will put in addition to inflation, inflationary pressures. So if you said that what's the average for this job, and as per your previous example, they recruited somebody who is the best thing since sliced bread, who is on an astronomical wage, there will be blips of people, and they're not going to take a pay cut, right? So they can't afford to pay everybody. It's like, how do you square that circle? Is that the expression, or whatever, around that circle, that square, whatever it is? But I mean, that's the concern that people have got. But I suppose that is the unfairness that's baked in. I mean, I can see why companies are going to resist it, I suppose, is what I'm saying. Is it something that you would evolve towards?
Yeah, I mean, there's two main reasons why we find that organizations, leaders are not sharing. One is the inequities. People sitting at different points within the pay range because they've negotiated different salaries, or we ask the question, what is your current salary? And the other is that we usually, or often, we're recruiting people on salaries that are higher than our existing employees or our loyal employees, because the market is moving, but there's no mechanism for us to progress pay for our people as they develop their knowledge, their skills, their contribution. So they don't want to show employees that, we're willing to pay more than what we pay you to people who are just coming in.
Well, it's funny you say that. I just remember one of the companies I used to work for, there's a well-known saying, and a lot of people left and returned. They said the only way to get a decent pay rise was to leave and come back. So, that it is so it's actually the internal processes of not being able to have the flexibility to reward people maybe in line with their value that's part of the problem. But ultimately, all of this is pushing people's salaries up, isn't it? The other big concern for me with pay transparency is I think it could be really demotivational, because if you have sight of the fact that there's someone in your area and you're the top performer or whatever you believe yourself to be, and you have an average salary and you know that your salary is average or you're below average, there is a way of almost demotivating more people through being transparent, isn't there?
I think part of it is the language that we use. So, not saying, you're average, but actually sometimes we have this conversation to say, oh, I'm at the market rate. Why am I only at the market rate? But actually being in the market rate means you're doing a job really well and you're performing well. And so it's a good place to be. But there is also research. So there's a company in the US called PayScale, and they did this research where a group of employees were paid below the market rate and the job satisfaction rates were 42%. And when organizations explained to them, were transparent, explained the reasons why they were paid below the market rates, their job satisfaction rates went up to 82%. And so there's a lot of research that shows us that sometimes we don't even have to increase salaries. It's just treating people like adults at a basic level, right? It's saying, we're not saying we feel that you can't handle this information, so we're going to share this with you, we're not going to share that with you. It's just being honest. And that same sort of survey or PayScale found that one of the best predictors of employee engagement was an organization's ability to communicate clearly and honestly about pay. So it's not what we pay people, it's being able to communicate honestly and clearly, because you might be at the midpoint of the range and other people are at the top, but ultimately what they want to know is it fair that I'm at this stage, and how can I get to the top end of that pay range, or is it possible?
And I can think there are other factors that should also, I mean, you don't really want to publish a pay range when there's only 3 people in that job role. Do you know that? Because that's kind of exposing. I would have said, but you almost need to have something which has got a large enough sample potentially. That's my opinion.
Well, so we're a small team, and we have this rule that anything that we do for a client, we have to do ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
So we have our own job levels, we have our own salary ranges, and everyone can see what our salary ranges are and where they sit within those ranges. And we have definitions for what roles should sit in each band, what are the expectations for different points within the band. So if we can do it with, 8 people, then I think there's no reason why, a 50 or 100 employee organization can't do it.
Good. Okay, so I think we won't go into pay transparency further, because I think there's loads more. People can buy your book and learn more about it. Certainly, I mean, transparency, you can see, is a good thing. People feeling engaged and motivated and fairly treated has got to be the key, hasn't it, in many of these ways. But I suppose it's getting there from where we are at the moment is part of the challenge as well. You can't necessarily do it overnight. So another challenge. But fundamentally, if people want to know more about your salary trend survey, can you tell them? I assume they can come and download it from your website, can they, Rameez? Or if they want to get in touch with you and to work with you and your team to try and apply greater pay transparency?
Yeah. So our website is 3r-strategy.com. And so the survey is available to download for free on the website. We're actually currently running a pulse survey, because this survey was run at the end of last year, and we were thinking inflation is really high. Are some of these budgets going to go up now that people have seen inflation has continued to be high? So our deadline is actually Friday, tomorrow. So this pulse survey is publishing up-to-date numbers on pay budgets for this year, again, by sector. So if anyone wants to participate, again, they can come to our website, get in touch, and they'll get a free copy of the report.
Great. So by the time this podcast goes out, they'll have the report. But let's maybe share the link. Let's get sharing it on. I'll grab it off you, Rameez, and we'll push it. Yes. I'll get some people who may listen later to participate in it. Wonderful. Rameez, it's been a really interesting topic. I found that fascinating. So thank you so much for sharing your research and expertise there.
Thanks, Lucinda.
I really hope you found this week's episode useful and enjoyable. If you did, perhaps you could recommend us to a friend or colleague, or give us a review on your platform of choice. It really helps new listeners to find us. Now, you can access links to any of the information mentioned in this show via the website www.hruprising.com. Further free resources are also available at www.actus.co.uk. There you can also find out more about our software and training solutions. Finally, why not join our LinkedIn group, the HR Uprising, to share ideas and collaborate with other like-minded people professionals. Thank you for listening to the HR Uprising podcast.